year ago last April, we did a discussion here on AI and its use in documentary filmmaking with Philip Shane and Basil Shadid, and it became apparent when over 800 people RSVP'd for it that there's a bit of interest in this subject of AI. And it became clear it was just like an explosion of interest. But, you know, as useful as it is in so many ways in documentary filmmaking, it was also really clear there were all sorts of concerns about AI. Not just that, you know, how it impacts documentary filmmaking, but in a larger context, you know, will this be the end of mankind and bring down our doom? So we knew we always sort of wanted to balance it with kind of, you know, looking at the other side of AI, not necessarily looking at it from a doomsday perspective, but like, what are some of the concerns that we need to address as an industry? You know, what are the ethical concerns? I mean, you know, what are, you know, one of the immediate issues was like the algorithm bias, that these were, you know, who is programming AI and who are they? Are they, you know, they're basically white men coming from a white male perspective. Is that an issue? Yeah, maybe. You know, so what was so interesting to us at the D-Word was when we learned about the Archival Producers Alliance and that they were working on a set of guidelines for the industry in dealing with this. We really wanted to get together with them and figure out a way to bring it to you guys and let you know about it. It's going to be published, my understanding is it's going to be published soon, but we have two really renowned archival producers, and I mean, they're also come from a background of producing, directing, and editing as well. But archival is their passion and what they've been up to lately, and they're the co-founders of the Archival Producers Association, or APA as we will now call it. Stephanie Jenkins and Rachel Antell. And I just want to get them on camera as soon as possible, let them introduce themselves, give you all the background about how this came to be. And it's going to be mostly in the form of a presentation for the first part. I will pop in afterwards with questions, a couple of questions of my own, but I'm going to give at least the last half hour for your questions. You people attending, you wonderful people out there in the dark. So you can put questions up in the chat, but really the best thing to do, we're not going to get to those for the most part. It's much better if you use the raised hand function after the presentation is done. And I will be calling on people in the order that I see their hands. So without further ado, Rachel and Stephanie, welcome. We're just like so pleased to have you here, and take it away.
Thank you, Doug. And thank you all for being here. It's amazing to see so many people coming out for this. So my name's Rachel Antell. I've worked in documentary for about 25 years now. And it was about 15 years ago, I was working on a documentary with Nancy Cates. I was a co-producer on a film about Susan Sontag, and I ended up doing a lot of archival work for that film and really fell in love with it. And when that production was over, I ended up joining forces with my colleague Jen Petroselli, and we formed something called Sub-Basement Archival, which works exclusively we work as archival producers on a really wide range of documentaries, from big network and streaming productions to independent films, you know, that are where funding is being cobbled together by grants and people's credit cards and things like that. So we've had the honor of working on films like Crip Camp by Jim Lebrecht and Nicole Newnham, 37 Words and the Way I See It by Dawn Porter, a film about Dolores Huerta by Peter Bratt, and many, many, many others. And it's been an amazing journey, and I'm sure you're curious why you have archival producers talking to you about artificial intelligence, but we'll get to that soon. Steph?
So, hi, I'm Stephanie Jenkins. I've worked with Ken Burns and Florentine Films since 2010 on multiple projects, including most recently, I produced and archival produced an 8-hour series about Muhammad Ali that came out on PBS in 2021. I also worked on the Central Park Five, Jackie Robinson, and a film about public housing called East Lake Meadows, A Public Housing Story. And that's all with Ken Burns, Sarah Burns, and Dave McMahon. And then beyond that, I've done a lot of freelance archival producing for Radio Lab and, also with Spike Lee. And most recently, I was a senior archival producer on a really wonderful series on the OpDocs vertical on the New York Times called Encore, where we took short films from the past and restored them for the website. And then, yes, now I am a very proud co-founder and co-director of the Archival Producers Alliance with Rachel and Jen Petroselli. So here we go.
So as an archival producer, I spent a lot of time digging into and thinking about the past. But over the last year, my thoughts have turned to the future and concerns about how the documentary community can maintain its commitment to truth and preservation of history, given how generative AI is transforming the media ecosystem. We know that AI is here to stay, and some of you may be really excited about the promise that it holds, and others of you may be filled with dread about what's coming, and there may be a mix of those two feelings for a lot of you. And those were the things that brought Steph and Jen and myself together last summer of 2023, to discuss our concerns about how Gen AI was going to impact the documentary film industry, as well as our work with archival media. Both things that we care really deeply about. And we had started seeing photorealistic historic images being generated and brought into documentary workflows. And as gatekeepers for the authenticity of archival materials, that raised some alarm bells for us. So we came together and gathered a whole group of other archival producers to discuss what they were seeing. And we found that most of them shared our unease. And the enthusiasm for those meetings encouraged us to formalize the group as the Archival Producers Alliance. And we wrote an open letter, which was signed by 100 documentary professionals, which raised this issue. And the letter was, the Hollywood Reporter published an article about our organization in November and printed the letter in its entirety. And the response to that was overwhelmingly positive, as we found that filmmakers and executives are really hungry for some guidance about this new and useful and powerful creative tool. But guidance is needed. So from January through March, about 15 members of our organization met weekly to research, discuss, and write a first draft of guidelines for best practices when using Gen AI in documentaries. And I'm using the term Gen AI for generative artificial intelligence, and we'll get into a little bit of the definition for that in a minute. We then presented the first draft at IDA's Getting Real conference in April. And we were on a panel with someone from Willa, which is a film company that made Another Body, as well as Shauna Swanson from ITVS and John Cessary-Goff from the Ford Foundation. They were respondents. And after that, we got a lot of feedback from the people gathered, and then we took the draft and consulted with lawyers, with E&O insurers, with a lot of documentary filmmakers, standards and practice experts from PBS, as well as, of course, our own membership, to create a final document, which we completed a few weeks ago and for which we're now gathering endorsements, and which will be published in September. We've also recently put together an advisory board, which includes our senior advisor, Pat Ofterheide, who we're very honored to have working with us, and I see is here today. Thank you, Pat. So I want to just say that what we produced is not a legal document, but it's an ethical one. And it is really geared towards documentary filmmakers, distributors, and funders. So it's just to be clear on what it is and what it isn't. That is what it is. Good. Steph?
Okay, so I am going to just share my screen here. It would be great if you could pin my screen share as well. Zoom share. Oops. Okay, so I just want to start here. So in today's talk, we're going to cover the magic of the archive, a glimpse of the offline. We're basically going to be taking you through our process of creating this document and then get to that document itself. So first that, and then we're going to talk about GenAI tools that are currently available for creating text to video, including Sora, Luma, and Runway. GenAI and Docs, some examples so far. Some examples of GenAI use, algorithmic bias, and generative fill, so you know what we're talking about. A brief primer on how courts are responding so far. As we know, the copyright situation as it comes to generative AI is very complicated and always changing. And then we're going to talk about our guidelines. We're going to step you through a summary of everything that we are going to present and publish in September. And then we'll do next steps of the APA and a Q&A. And at the end, I'm going to share a set of links to all of the to our website and also all of the things that we mentioned in the talk that are, and also include other guidelines and things like that. So sit tight, you will be getting more links, and you can just read so much about generative AI when we're all done. So some context to get started. What is an archival producer? Let's talk about Gen AI versus AI, acknowledging that the walls are thinning by the day. And then from there, we're going to talk a little bit about what's at stake and how to have a conversation amidst so much change. So we will get started with what is an archival producer. So as it says here, this is via the Documentary Producers Alliance, the DPA. The archival producer is typically responsible for every stage and aspect related to the archival materials needed for a documentary, including research, acquisition of materials, organizing, budgeting, and final licensing. The archival producer works closely with the producer and director in pre-production and production phases, and with the editor in post-production to assess footage, stills, and ephemera required to tell the story narratively, creatively, visually, and cogently. The archival producer conducts research independently and may oversee and direct a team of researchers on a large-scale project. And to this definition, I also want to add that a big part of our jobs as archival producers is also about maintaining the veracity of what is on screen. We research exhaustively, work closely with families of subjects, familiarize ourselves with the time period that we're showing. And we do that so we can do whatever we can to tell the story in the best way possible. And I think that there's also an emphasis on the integrity of images, audio, moving images that we find. And part of that requires us to bridge gaps between archives, productions, which also includes legal and the boardrooms of people licensing us stuff, and everybody on our production itself. And of course, we also maintain a list of hundreds of contacts in archives who are often the gatekeepers of materials. So when you hire an archival producer, you're hiring a lot of their experience. And that often helps productions as they grow. So next, AI versus Gen AI. So this is via the IBM blog, and this is important just to set the table for what we're talking about. So artificial intelligence refers to computer systems capable of performing complex tasks that historically only a human could do, such as reasoning, making decisions, or solving problems. And then generative AI refers to deep learning models that can generate high quality text, image, and other content based on the data that they were trained on. So most importantly, we're really concerned with new materials that are being created by machines. We know that AI is very important for workflows such as transcription, logging, reading handwriting, all sorts of things. It's an amazing tool and is an amazing tool to archives as well as filmmakers, of course. But we are really concerned with generative AI.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the changing technology and what is at stake. What are the stakes here? Because there is great potential with this technology, but there are also risks. And specific ones to documentary, I think. So documentary has long been a beacon of public trust and education. And when people sit down to watch a documentary, they're making a choice. They could choose to watch a docudrama or a historical fiction. Those are perfectly reasonable choices. But a viewer choosing to watch a documentary wants to be able to trust that what's being presented as real is in fact real. Even though, of course, that reality is going to have a point of view. And once that trust is broken, it can be very difficult to win back as an industry. Another risk is that when you're mixing the real with the unreal, interspersing them, things can get confusing. An image or an audio clip that's presented as real in one documentary is going to be lifted out of that film, make its way onto the internet or into other films, and it becomes forever a part of the historical record. We've already seen misinformation proliferating social media and newsrooms in recent years, and documentary is definitely not immune to that. We're about to experience a deluge of archival materials that aren't real. And if there aren't some guardrails in place, we're in danger of really muddying the historical record in a way that's going to be impossible to untangle. Another concern is how this technology is going to change jobs and budgets and possible timelines for documentary films. Gen AI is considerably cheaper and quicker than researching and licensing true archival materials. So some of the questions we're asking is, will funders be less willing to fund documentaries that use real archival because Gen AI is so much less expensive? And could that make archival materials even more expensive if fewer people are using it? Does the speed of AI mean that expectations for documentary production timelines are going to speed up as well? That's certainly another concern. And as we saw in the SAG and WGA strikes, AI is going to deeply affect the labor market. And the greater our reliance on it is, the more that's going to become a possibility. I mean, Gen AI, is it going to replace archival producers? I certainly hope not. But those are examples of some of the things that are at stake as we begin to integrate this technology and are worth being aware of. We're engaging in this conversation at a time when the technology is really changing every day. This is just, when we started this work, we were in a completely different ecosystem than we're in right now, and it's been just about a year. So we're aware of how much is evolving both on that level and also with the legal landscape. But we're keeping our thinking very much grounded in the principles that documentary has long held. And we want this work to affirm the values, the documentary values of research, education, storytelling, and artistry. And that at the heart of documentary is a belief in the importance of humans bearing witness. Steph?
So
back to you.
So I'm just gonna start with one of my favorite things, which is going to archives. So something that got me really interested in generative AI when Rachel and Jen approached me to start this project was, wait a second, people are generating, but I know how little is actually online. And I've had the opportunity as an archival producer and a producer with Ken Burns to go deep into an archive. So this, what you're seeing here on this slide is the WHAS archive in Louisville, Kentucky. It took me almost 2 years to actually get in and get access to it. This is in a sub basement in Louisville. They have lost over 70% of their archive to floods. And this is really not accessible to researchers generally, and not even really to the WHAS staff. And is owned by Tegna. So it was really using persistence and a long timeline and the budget that I was given that I was able to get in here. And when I ended up spending about 10 days in the archive, and through opening individual reels, I found what I believe is the earliest moving image material of Muhammad Ali that exists. It's him signing up for an amateur boxing tournament when he was 12. And also what we were able to do in this archive is show the Louisville that he really grew up in. And that's an important thing for putting people in time. And that material of Louisville in the 1940s, 1950s was really not available anywhere. It was really only available sitting in these undigitized film cans. And so I am fortunate enough, as I said, to work for a filmmaker with this budget, but I will also say that anybody can do deep file research, and it doesn't need to be expensive. And certainly, I recommend to all people making any documentary to always talk with your film subjects to see if they have photographs or film reels, talk with local libraries, historical societies, universities. And of course, we're very fortunate to have the Library of Congress, the National Archives, archive.org, and Critical Past, and others who do provide affordable public domain materials. And just a little pitch in general for archival producers. Part of working with an archival producer is that they'll know how to find materials in your budget and in your time frame, and be able to set expectations. So that's my little pitch. Bring on archival producers early. You will save yourself time and money, and maybe a couple of years off your life. So again, I mean, looking at this, here's another example of an archive. Like, this is kind of typical. If I'm finally able to talk to like the fourth night editor at a news station and like get into an office, this is not WHAS, this is a different archive. I'm not going to disclose which one. This is typical. It's just a lot of film material. There's so little that's digitized. And this is the material that is, as I said before, really going to give you the details. And just again, back to WHAS, this is like a film book. This is a catalog of everything that was offline that I was able to go through. And that's how I found the early images of Muhammad Ali. So no matter what the budget, you need to work. It takes time to get good archives. And I think one of the things I love about working with offline archives is that archive moves at a human pace. You can't really rush it because you need someone to go to their storage unit to find the picture of them from when they were little, or like whatever it is. And that is in deep contrast to the way that Silicon Valley wants us to work, which is faster and faster all the time. And this is something about documentary that, while it's inconvenient, I do think it's really important to preserve. Yeah, and we'll also get into, this is, what I'm talking about here is materials that do exist. We are going to get into issues of algorithmic bias in the archive. And I also want to say here, so little is saved and so much archive was actively suppressed or destroyed. So there's also a whole swath of really important material that will never exist, of communities that most often need to be documented and whose stories we really need to know. So anyway, that's my little spiel about the offline.
So now we're going to be going from that beautifulness to where we are now. The first time that I saw Gen AI used was about a little over a year ago, and I was working on a documentary that was a broad survey piece, and we were tasked with finding a photograph of a woman from the turn of the century, the early 20th century, for whom there were no images. It was a time, obviously, when cameras did exist, but it wasn't like they were all over the place. And she was not a famous figure. So the production team decided to use Gen AI, I think it was Mid-Journey, to create a realistic seeming image of her, which would then be interspersed with the other archival imagery. It was the first time we hadn't even considered that AI was going to be coming in. This was right when ChatGPT was starting to come online and becoming more common in the mainstream. But we never thought it was going to hit this quickly in documentaries, and we were finally seeing it. And the photo that they generated was good. It was really good. I was working, with the material, and I didn't know what it was. I was like, Jen, did you find this photo? Did you know? I didn't think anything existed of her. And then we found out that actually this was a generated photo. But that generated image made a lot of assumptions about what the person looked like, what trees or buildings she might have seen or been near, what she wore, what her facial expressions would have been, and so on. And the audience then is going to assume a certain authenticity or veracity to those details that just isn't true. And those details are absorbed by a viewer and consciously or unconsciously incorporated into what we all think we know about that person or about that moment in time. Images of a real place or a real person, they have an indexical quality that a generated one cannot. So we saw this happening, and that was concerning. But at the time, it certainly was not possible, and we thought it was way off before we'd be seeing video created from vocal prompts, from voice prompts. We thought it was far off, but fast forward just 9 months later, and OpenAI releases a demo of Sora, which is its text-to-video platform. It's not available to the public yet, but it will be soon, and it's getting better by the day. So, and not surprisingly, in the following months, there were similar releases of other technologies. So I'm going to show you, this is an example that Sora released. The prompt had been historical footage of California in the gold rush. So you can see it's pretty good. This is its very first foray into the public eye, and it's not bad, but here are some things to think about. For some reason, the feel of the footage is 1970s, maybe because the prompt had been historical footage, I'm not sure. And at the same time, it looks to be a drone shot. So the technology that's implied back to the 1850s, I guess, is that drones might have existed, which they didn't until 150 years later. And then finally, there's just the implications of what we're seeing, of who was there, the color of their clothes, how big the trees were, how high the river was, all of these assumptions that the machine is making in creating this that we absorb and assume to be historic. And this is a very short clip, but as Steph said, archival work moves at a human pace and computers do not. And artificial intelligence moves faster than anything we can imagine. It's exponential, both its ability to improve. In 6 months, it's going to look so much better than that. But what's not going to change is that it is machines making the assumptions of what's being seen, and that we don't know who that is, who has that accountability, because there's really this accountability. There's authority without accountability. So that was
Sora. Yeah. And just this week, or just this month, actually, Luma Dream Machine and Runway Gen 3 were launched. You can't create great archival yet, but you can see it's becoming eerily convincing. And also Sora films have started to make the rounds. Sora films made by filmmakers on Sora, which are prompts that are made, are now at Tribeca Film Festival, and there are also generative AI festivals. So here's just something I generated this week. historic footage of New York in the 1970s. Like, it's pretty funky. People are kind of walking backwards, but you wonder, like, who are these people? This is an unspecific thing, but if you're in a documentary, you might not notice. If you're just watching a documentary, or if it's on YouTube or whatever it is, someone might not notice that it's not real. So yeah, a few more. I'll skip my foray into it. So one thing that's really important is, as we said, those don't look amazing, but here's an example of still images, generated images 2 years apart. So if you look on the left, that's Midjourney from 2022, and the prompt is photograph of a convenience store on a rainy night, shimmering light, overexposure, glitch style. So if you look on the left and you look on the right, that's the difference in just 2 years. So I'll go to the next one. This is grand piano, keyboard, close-up view, under forest shade, volumetric light, realistic depth of field. So you see on the left, it looks kind of silly. And then on the right, it looks like it could be a real photograph. So something very similar will happen with footage when people are like, oh, it's not going to get that great. I disagree. So, and another thing to keep in mind is this is with photos is getting better, with footage is getting better. With audio, it is extraordinary. It is hard to tell because audio is so much smaller in its size. It is harder to tell what is generated and what is not. And we've seen that a lot from deepfakes of all kinds. But it is a technique that filmmakers are starting to employ, which we'll get to as well. So just something also to keep in mind, according to Every Pixel Journal, more than 15 billion images have been created. And this was from August 23. So we're already past, this is from a year ago, right? So more than 15 billion images have been created using text-to-image algorithms since last year. To put this in perspective, it took photographers 150 years from the first photograph taken in 1826 until 1975 to reach the same number, the 15 billion mark. So when people say, well, how is this so different, generated AI versus like editing? We all Frankenbite things. We help subjects, make the most sense. I think what I think about this, it is a matter of scale. 15 billion images in a year, and it's probably doubled since then. So it is a matter of scale. This is flooding the internet, which means it's flooding archives. It's flooding people's imaginations. So that's a very, just a big thing to keep in mind on why we are taking this so seriously.
Okay, so we also really want to acknowledge that there are many exciting possibilities for Gen AI within documentary. Gen AI can help to tell stories that have been overlooked, purposely suppressed, or not recorded in any fashion. It can also help to protect the identities of people for whom appearing in a documentary can present risk. And we've seen some examples of how important that is recently, I know. One such film that uses technology with great success in that way is Welcome to Chechnya by David France. And another one is a documentary called Another Body, directed by Reuben Hamlin and Sophie Compton.
Oops.
This is a film, well, we're not going to show the trailer as it turns out. It's a film about some women who were harmed by deepfake pornography, and the filmmakers used that same deepfake technology to change the faces and voices of the main characters to protect their identity. And what was amazing was they were so intentional in their use of this at every step of the process. So it was done with the consent, not just of the characters whose identity was being obscured, but of the actors whose faces were used to create the facial mask. That's a really important thing, as we saw in the SAG strike. They were also completely transparent with the audience, which is something we talk about a lot in the document. It's kind of the heart of our guidelines, is that it's not necessarily about not using generative AI, but it is about always allowing the audience to know. And there are many, many different ways of doing that. The way they did it in this film, because it made sense, was to incorporate it in the storytelling. There's a reveal about 13 minutes in that the people you've been seeing and the voices you've been hearing are not theirs, but that they were generated by AI. And it's very powerful and it makes sense. And it does a lot in that particular case. It really does a lot for the story. And in other films, I mean, there are certainly other ways to obscure someone's identity. We all know you can pixelate them, have them in shadow, all those things. But what you miss in those instances is the emotion on the person's face, the facial expressions, which add so much to their storytelling. And by putting like this facial mask that deepfake technology is able to create on the person, you enable the viewer to experience the person's emotions and facial expressions and all those subtleties while still obscuring their identity. So that's something we've seen done with great success and think it has terrific possibility. Steph?
Yeah. So we're going to talk about some other examples of how people are using generative AI now and how we predict they will. So when we began talking with archival producers a year ago about this subject, they were already being asked to put generative AI materials in their films. Some examples were outlined in the public letter that we wrote, and I'll talk about these. And something to keep in mind is these are NDA'd a lot of the time. So a lot of these examples are on background. So I hope you know they do sound vague perhaps, but it's because they can't necessarily say what it is. But we definitely believe all of our archival producers when they say they're being asked to use generative AI. And something I also want to say that's really important here is I 100% give filmmakers the benefit of the doubt. I do not think that people are trying to pull one over by using this tech. Demands are high, labor practices are extractive, archive is expensive, and our timeframes are shorter. And we want to tell our stories, and we have a new tool. But it doesn't. I'm bringing up these examples because they also do raise alarm bells, and these are part of why we decided to write our guidelines. So the first is the use of generative AI to create historical voices, leading viewers to believe that they are hearing authentic primary sources when they are not. So famously, this happened in the Anthony Bourdain documentary. But I also have heard about a lack of clarity when archival versus generated voices are intercut. So another is creating historical images to depict people and events rather than sourcing real ones where available in order to save time and money. Another is generating fake newspaper articles and headlines, removing viewers from fact-based sources. And another is generating recreations and non-existent historical artifacts without identifying them as such.
Okay. So algorithms, we're going to talk a little bit about algorithmic assumptions. Algorithms are the basis of generative AI, and algorithms make assumptions. So we advise filmmakers to consider the role played by algorithmic bias when they're using generative AI to create an image or voice, both in reinforcing stereotypes, but also in overcorrecting to combat them, because we've seen examples of both now. Generative AI encodes every bias of its data set, and additionally, most Gen AI models draw from an incomplete version of the historical record, because as Steph was talking about, the vast majority of physical audiovisual archives still remain undigitized, and they're only pulling from what's online. And as we all know, what's online is a very specific thing. One of the places I saw that in working on a film where there were a lot of still images being generated that had women in them. And we started to notice that whether the woman was from the 1500s, the 1900s, the 20th century, they all looked an awful lot like Angelina Jolie. It was all different versions of her. And it was just different people who had this because there's a disproportionate number of actresses and models who look a very specific way and give a very specific image of beauty on the internet, and that's what's being pulled from. And all those same stereotypes, carry across racial lines and, class lines and all of those different things. You put in CEO and you're going to get an old white man. And these kind of things, obviously, we all know can be very dangerous. Now, we also know, of course, that human-made media and the archive have a lot of bias as well. They absolutely are biased. However, with a piece of human-generated media, the authorship and the context can be known, which enables you to frame the biases, debate the biases, wrestle with the biases. But in contrast, a piece of synthetic media, which contains a bias, it has no known author. There is no one to argue with, and no way to know how it came to the decisions it came to. So it carries this presumed authority, but no accountability, which I think is another level of, it makes it a little more dangerous. Another issue that we're wrestling with is generative fill on photos, which is something that we're seeing a lot of. In Adobe Photoshop, it's easy to take a vertical photograph and have Gen AI fill in the rest so that it can complete a 16:9 frame. And that can seem pretty innocent, or, it's hard to know why that would be such a problem. You're adding trees, you're adding buildings, it can make those assumptions, but you're adding things that weren't there. And even if that's empty space, you're introducing the idea that a place is more desolate than maybe it was. And all of these give a different feel to the image than it originally had. Additionally, it's implying that, say, a 1930s family had a wide-angle lens for family photos, which is introducing a historical inaccuracy just by the fact of it, being placed in that time. And the same is true when creating simulated voices. One of the things that we are seeing a lot now is when people are making a film about a historic figure who's no longer here, having their voice recreated to maybe even read something that they wrote themselves. So like their journals or their letters. And so the words are theirs and the voice sounds like theirs. So the assumption is that this is all real and it feels real to the audience. But the inferences that are there, and there are so many of them, it's what the machine made. What is their tone of voice? What is the emotion behind their words? The pacing, the emphasis, all of these changes how we perceive what's being said. And they're all machine-made assumptions, but it's hard to imagine a viewer being able to reasonably tease apart what is real and what's not in that case. I mean, I know I couldn't. So, yeah, so that is what we're thinking about in terms of some of the things around bias and how that gets introduced into generative AI work.
So talking about copyright and where these come from is a whole other 2-hour-long talk. So I'm going to go through 3 sides extremely quickly, but know that it is changing. When I give you the materials at the end of our talk, there's a link to a really great website called Knowing Machines Legal Explainer that follows all of the current court cases around copyright and generative AI. So definitely worth keeping track of that. This came out not that long ago on the New York Times. Amongst the nuggets of this article, How Tech Giants Cut Corners to Harvest Data for AI, the New York Times says that OpenAI likely transcribed 1 million hours of YouTube video transcripts to train their models. This is copyrighted material that is put up by YouTube users and is not supposed to be taken in that way. And just last week, the Microsoft's AI boss, Mustafa Suleyman, said, when in an interview with Andrew Ross Sorkin, he said, quote, "I think that with respect to content that's already on the open web, the social contract of that content since the 90s has been it is fair use. Anyone can copy it, recreate it, reproduce it. That has been freeware, if you like. That's been the understanding," end quote. And I don't know if that has been the understanding. And so it's just really complicated. We don't know where it's going to go as far as at this point in the US, my understanding is you cannot copyright a generated image because there is not enough human authorship on it. However, that's also complicated, and we also have some amazing lawyers on this call, so I will end there. But just know that when you are considering using generative AI in your materials, you must consult legal counsel because it is very complicated.
So based on everything, oh, sorry.
Go for it.
You good? Okay.
Yeah.
So based on everything that we've been talking about so far, and knowing that people are going to be using Gen AI in documentaries, we wanted to create a set of best practices to help guide people in thinking about these issues. So coming in September, this is the document we produced, and it will be published on our website. And currently we're gathering endorsements from industry organizations and filmmakers before we publish. And so I want to clarify what the document is and is not. So first of all, as we said, it's not a legal document, but an ethical one that looks to affirm and protect the values of that the documentary communities have always held. And second, I want to be clear that we really are only addressing generative AI, which, as we defined earlier, it's the type of artificial intelligence that creates images, video, or audio in response to user prompts. And we distinguish it from other types of artificial intelligence, which we're already using in production workflows for ideation, for transcription, for logging, et cetera. Also, we're not talking about using Gen AI to do minor alteration of existing audiovisual assets like retouching or restoration or upresing. What we are addressing is the creation of new materials or alterations to real archival materials, which might change their meaning and mislead the audience.
So the up on the slide, I have an outline, and that's what we're going to talk you through here. So our document is broken into several sections. The first is our opening statement, which asserts what is essential about documentary film and about archival and why it needs to be protected. And it also acknowledges how both Gen AI may benefit the field of documentary and also what risks that it may bring. I want to be clear that, as we said before, we're addressing generative AI. So the second part is a practical guide for filmmakers who are grappling with whether and how to integrate Gen AI into their work. This is followed by a conclusion, next steps, and an explanation of methodology that brought us to this point and continues today. And the guidelines advise filmmakers to consider 4 distinct areas when using Gen AI. The first is the value of primary sources. And by primary sources, we mean authentic archival footage, photos, and audio. And here we make a case for considering use of this first, because they provide a window, because primary sources provide a window into a specific event that happened at an actual time and place and was witnessed by a real human. And while we are very much aware of the bias that the archive represents, as we talked about earlier, we assert that the authorship and context can be known, and therefore biases can be understood, framed, and wrestled with. When filmmakers do opt for Gen AI in lieu of archival materials, we offer 4 things to consider. 1, the potential for their creation to impact the historic record, because when we're making a documentary, we're also making a document. We're making a document of how we understand history, and that will be anything that we make and put into a context of that document may be passed along. 2, we ask for people to consider algorithmic bias of the software that they're using. 3, consider how using Gen AI changes the meaning of the material. For example, the generative fill example that Rachel gave earlier. And 4, treating the creation of Gen AI images or audio with the same intentionality and care that would be used in recreation or reenactment.
Yeah. That feels like a really important point, so I'm just going to re-emphasize that.
Yeah, please.
People often ask us, haven't we already discussed this? Like, how is this different from a reenactment? And it is on a continuum with reenactments for sure. But we do think, again, it's a matter of scale. And part of the reason is the lack of expense and time that it takes to create a generative AI image versus a recreation. With the recreation, you've made an investment of your time and money to find actors, to hire a DP, to do historical research into creating this scene that you're creating. But Gen AI, it's just so quick and easy that you may not put that same kind of care into it. So
yeah, and I would also add to that, even we
mhm.
have a cinematic language for recreations that has changed over time. We do not yet have a cinematic language for generative AI. We may someday, but you know, in the way, so yeah, just something to add there.
So the second area of our guidelines, and probably the heart of it, addresses transparency. In order for documentary to remain a trusted form of media, we believe that any use of Gen AI should be knowable as such. We've broken that section down into inward transparency and outward transparency. So by inner transparency, we mean tracking every element of synthetic media that's either created or brought into the project and recording it in an AI cue sheet, which would be similar to what you are already using for music. There's a music cue sheet and an archival cue sheet. There should now be a Gen AI cue sheet because it's a new type of media. And then outward transparency is the transparency with the audience, which, as we've said, is crucial for maintaining the contract of trust between filmmaker and viewer. The third area of the document addresses the legal landscape, which, as you know, is rapidly evolving. And so we've tried to keep those guidelines broad enough that they'll continue to be useful as things evolve. But while that's all shaking out, our main piece of advice is to engage legal counsel who's really on top of the evolution of the laws. And then the final section of the guidelines addresses ethical considerations of creating human simulations. When using Gen AI technology to specifically alter or manipulate the face or body or voice of a real person, which is sometimes called a deep fake, we encourage filmmakers to take extra caution. We ask them to consider, for example, potential cultural sensitivities of using synthetic media, because there are many cultures in which that can be particularly problematic. And beyond that, we encourage people to consider, even though it's not legally required, but to consider getting consent from subjects when possible. And when it's not possible to get that consent, to take extra care with those subjects.
So we are winding down now. We've got we're just going to talk about next steps with the guidelines and the APA, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So as we said, we are currently gathering endorsements from the industry of these guidelines. Some exciting organizations that have endorsed include, we are proud to say, the D Word, the Camden Film Festival, the Big Sky Film Festival, True False, BAVAC, Video Consortium, Impact Partners, and many others. So we plan to release them around Labor Day, along with a press push. And we hope to create a toolkit for filmmakers, do workshops and teach-ins, and also speak at film festivals. This is a volunteer enterprise, and if you want to become a member, here's a QR code on this slide, and also go to archivalproducersalliance.com. Members are currently defined as archival producers or anyone who supports archival producers. So please do become a member. With membership, we do a monthly meeting. We do have a speaker series and are going to start doing kind of meetups, digital meetups, and we keep each other posted on things that are important to our community of archival producers. And then if you would like to donate or have any thoughts on individuals or foundations who would like to partner, please do. We are looking for travel support to support these guidelines, and also attend conferences and do the work that we know is really important, which is creating a toolkit to take the guidelines into something that's digestible, so filmmakers know how to use them. And also, this is continuing. The technology is always changing. So we wrote these guidelines hoping we wouldn't have to revise them a lot. We wrote them more as documentary principles that are firm, but we will inevitably have to revise them if major changes and when major changes take place.
And then just a little bit about our organization and what we're doing beyond Gen AI, because this is also about archival. We're looking to do what we can to make sure that true archival stays relevant, a relevant and central part of the documentary filmmaking landscape. So to that end, we're working to encourage private and federal intervention in supporting archives so that they're not lost. We're advocating for independent filmmakers around licensing cost. I have to say, since I navigate between independent projects and bigger ones, one of the most frustrating things I find is that at certain archives, I'm paying less for the same image if I'm working with a big company than if I'm working with an independent producer. And that's the opposite of what it should be. So we really want to work on some advocacy around that because it really gets at who gets to tell stories. We are also planning to present these best practices to archives themselves to encourage them to start clearly labeling any Gen AI that's making its way in, as well as labeling true archival. And we're talking with different entities around how to do that, to put systems in place, because that's going to be really important in protecting the stream of archival. In addition, we'd like to help educate archives and filmmakers about what it means to sell their materials and metadata to tech companies, because we've been approached by archives who have been approached by tech companies offering to digitize what they have offline, which of course is very tempting for a small archive that doesn't have the money necessarily to do that themselves. But in exchange, they want to be able to scrape the archives for building their own models. And we've been talking through with archives what we think that could potentially mean for them in the longer term. We're looking to raise awareness about issues in preservation and also to raise the profile of the role of archival producer. We're currently writing a best practices guide for working with archival producers. We'd like to see the profession become recognized. We've been talking to PGA and ADIS about getting greater recognition and increasing possible awards for archival producers. So we're big champions of the field, and we're very excited. We currently have about 400 members from around the country and from around the world at this point, actually.
So as promised, here's a QR code and I'll also put it in the chat, to some of the articles that we referenced and some resources, including the Knowing Machines and also our website. And just to end on a positive note, before we go into the Q&A, starting to do this work has been, and think about all of this, has been really amazing. We've had so many volunteers that are archival producers, filmmakers, lawyers, all sorts of people coming around this document and just showing up every day to show how much they care about documentaries and how they want this medium to move forward as a trusted source. And I really believe in what the documentary community will continue to do as far as bearing witness to human experience. And this has shown me that over and over again. So yeah, so thank you. Thus concludes our talk, and yeah, let's have a little chat.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie and Rachel. That was a really fantastic presentation. And for those of you who came in late, we are recording this. It will be up on the D-Words YouTube channel within the week, hopefully by early next week. So look for it there in our weekly mailings. Hopefully you subscribe to our weekly mailings. You'll see a link there. Also, there are like an amazing number of great archival producers and archival researchers in today's sessions, and they've been introducing themselves in the chat. So Julie just put up a link in the chat to, or a notice of how you can save the chat She'll repeat it at various times, but we'll also give you time before you leave to save the chat and a reminder of that. Well, we're going to give over this time for your questions. Also, if you're an archival producer yourself and you have something you want to add, whether it's a comment, it doesn't have to necessarily be a question. If you want to say some concern of yours out of your own experience, we welcome you to do that now too. Please use the raised hand function, which is at the bottom under, you should see reactions. And if you click on that, it'll be raised hand. I mean, if you're on a phone and you want to ask a question, you can't access it, then put it in the chat. But for the most part, we'd much prefer you use the raised hand. And since I don't see any, I will kick some off, one or two off myself. I'm really, and I will save an important question for the end too. But I don't want to go there yet. But I'm really curious about the transparency issue. You talk about inward and outward, and inward kind of feels like a no-brainer, of being transparent with the people you're working with. Seems like it, in terms of,
yeah.
Okay, good, great. Well, in terms of, creating a cue sheet, for instance, I've had a little sneak peek at the guidelines, so where you go into detail about that. And I mean, that seems like a really great idea of keeping, an ongoing record of all the ways you and your team are using AI. And like we can have that own discussion, but it's the outward transparency that I'm really curious about, because you talk about possibly putting some kind of notification at the beginning titles and end titles. The fear is, you talk about maybe putting a lower third or something when you have an image or something. Will that take people out of the story to see, particularly if it's being used extensively and they're constantly being reminded, this is AI, this is AI. What's the best, most subtle way to do that makes it clear and is transparent, but doesn't pull you out of the narrative?
Rachel, do you mind if I
No,
respond? So I think a way to frame it is transparency with your audience when you're using an emerging technology. It is an invitation for them to trust you. Like that, it's not that you're pulling one over, it's not that you're doing anything bad, it's that people are really confused about what this technology is. There's a huge media literacy gap. And people are wary of this technology. So it doesn't necessarily need to be text. It doesn't need to be like a watermark, but something we say is like, really think about the visual language of your film. Maybe it's a different aspect ratio. Maybe it's colorized in a different way. Maybe the audio works differently. Maybe it's in closer to an animation or dream state. There are so many ways that you can indicate. And I think a really good just general question to ask an audience member or, somebody in a feedback screening is, was there ever a point where you weren't sure? Was it distracting to you? And these are questions that we ask in rough cuts all the time. That's the main feedback we always want. Were you bored or were you confused? And it's the same thing with this material. It's not yet established how audiences will think about it. And I think in general, they are mistrustful. And actually, I saw somebody who was the archival producer on What Jennifer Did in here. And that was a fascinating example. I admit I haven't seen the film, but what was fascinating to me was this was a true crime documentary that the internet accused the filmmakers of using generative AI on images. And then the executive producer came out and said, no, we didn't do that. But what it proved to me, and again, I haven't seen the film, but what it proved to me is how quick, like this is making audiences paranoid. Like how quick people are to be upset that they're being deceived, and how quickly trust erodes when this new technology moves into our medium. And so, you know, I feel bad for that team, and I hope they're all okay. And but it to me just proved this technology is new, and it that should be the focus, not on, yeah, I'm repeating myself. You got it.
Could I add something, Doug?
Yeah, sure, Pat.
I just I want to just reinforce that the point of transparency is transparency. It's not just checking the box. You know,
Yes.
so it's to say, how can we have people not notice our notice of transparency so that they can get on with being immersed in the film is denying that you need transparency. So I just want to reinforce what Jennifer said about, like, the function of this really is to make sure that people do understand and take themselves out of that moment enough to say, okay, now this was made up. And that is as a filmmaker, I think you have to decide whether using generative AI can accommodate that level of transparency. And if it can't, are you trying to put something past the viewer in a way that will inevitably reduce their trust, not just in your film, but in the Thank you.
That last part got garbled, but we got.
I think she said
what you were
not
saying.
in the form.
Okay.
In the form.
Anyway, thanks,
Yeah,
Pat.
thank
Thank
you.
you for the work you're doing with the guidelines as well, and all you do. All right, let's go to some of the questions. And again, if you work as an archival producer and want to come on and comment or ask a question, we really welcome to do so. Is it Rome? Is that, yeah,
I don't know. Can you hear me?
we can.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. See, I was looking at AI generation for a documentary I'm working on for World War One flying footage, because I'm having a hard time finding actual archival footage. And going and doing a full reenactment of what I would need is like prohibitive. And but I was unable to find anything. I was unable to find AGI that was able to even do it remotely closely. So, you know, now we're looking at reverting to the video game footage. And so on the same line, that's the same kind of thing, isn't it? Using video game footage to create your scene versus using AI? Would that be roughly the same issues?
Well, I mean, I think if you're using video game footage, presumably the audience isn't going to think it's actual footage from World War One. I mean, that sounds more like if you were using animation, which I think is sort of a different issue. You know, no one's going to think an animation is real if it looks like an animation, which it would. I haven't seen the video game footage you're talking about, but that would be my guess, is that it's more akin to that. What we're really worried about is where things get confused with real material and real moments in time. Not that it's just like people have used animation as a creative tool within documentary for a long time, and that hasn't been a problem in this way because there isn't that confusion.
And I will say, I mean, part of the reason we show the Sora clip is somebody could put that in a film about the gold rush. And I don't think that people necessarily have the media literacy actually to know that there weren't color drone cameras in 1848. One of our members told us that she recently was asked by a documentary director to find footage from the Civil War.
Right.
So I do think it's just, you need to really, so the Sora clip is important to me because it has all of those assumptions. It's a really good example of that. But also, we don't want people thinking that that material was real and actually existed, because it didn't.
Right.
So
So
it's about a distinction.
lots of historical video or documentaries, especially war ones, state right in there that it's a historical reenactment. But it's obvious, you can tell it's in color and it's looking very like new compared to what it would be in 1917.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It's always a
Yeah, thank you.
judgment call. All of these things are judgment calls. There's not like a hard and fast.
Yeah. Bruce, great to see you again. Fire away.
Yeah, great to be here, guys. Yes, I'm working on a doc called Looking for Laura Nelson. It's about my aunt that I discovered was lynched in 1911. And so we're playing with the sizzle. The editor is playing with some AI to generate some things. We're going to put it out for people to respond to it shortly. But finding documents is really difficult. And I was wondering, you say archivists, like I'm going to hopefully go there and shoot in Oklahoma, which where it's happened. But would you have access as an archivist to records from the court, or would you be able to get that because you need to go there? So how would that work? Because I don't think they've digitized that kind of stuff at all. And like I say, and also we're playing with it. We just have a sizzle reel where we're doing not the actual lynching, but when they broke down the door and took her out of the prison, out of the jail cell, we've done that, some AI and some other things. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. I mean, those things are very hard to find. First of all, finding out the story was like people were in denial about it.
Yeah.
And we do have actual photos of her and my cousin because they made a postcard and they were selling them. And that's the only reason we know, because they were out there. So we're looking at that, but we're going to use some AI for some things because a prerequisite to that, there was one guy that moved into Okima, black guy, and they burned his house down. And so we're going to use some AI to illustrate that because we won't be able to find that. So just wondering your thoughts about things that are more historical and racial in nature. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I think that first of all, your film sounds amazing, and it sounds like an incredible project. And that's sort of exactly what we were talking about how there are stories like that were actively suppressed, not documented, and there just isn't the archival to support it. So, I mean, that's a perfect case, I think, of where Gen AI can come in and be really useful. The only thing I would say is that you want the audience to know, and I don't think it takes away from the story. I think it enhances it, if anything, to make the point that these moments were recreated using Gen AI because they had been actively suppressed, because no one was going to document them, because like it reinforces the point of what's missing from the archive, what's missing from history. And so I think it's always important to be transparent with the audience, but that's a perfect example of where it could just be integrated into the story potentially, which is another way we talk about transparency sometimes happening. And in terms of what you were asking, yes, you're right. There's a lot of stuff that's not digitized in terms of records, and usually you'd have to go on site to a library or an archive to get those records. Sometimes you'll be able to find a librarian or historian there who's willing to do it for you. You may have to pay for the research, or they may have text records that you could look at ahead of time to know what it is you're looking for when you go. There are a lot of different ways, but if they exist, they should be accessible at some point. Yes.
Yeah, I'm really looking at for the court records, but it's funny, my editor put together a sizzle reel and he didn't tell me he did some AI with one of the things. He didn't say anything. And I was looking at it and I said, oh, that's a great image, and we were sitting looking at it because, I did AI to create that. He said the parameters took me about an hour and a half to tell it what I wanted because the first thing it did was just ridiculous. And but yeah, it's scary how it can do stuff. But we'll definitely say it looks different. It looks more like an image drawn almost. It looks like a sketch. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I would also say just make sure to for anybody considering using this, bring in legal counsel early, because there are requirements for different broadcasters and also all throughout the world around what is actually copyrightable and what is actually broadcastable as far as what is made by generative AI. And yeah.
A quick technical question before I get to the hand raised. Stephanie, you talked in your presentation, you showed the image of going into this archive it took you 2 years to get into, and faced with all these rolls of old film, and you bring up digitizing. How do you digitize all this old material? Do you bring it?
Oh,
Yeah.
well, in that case, we worked with a really great restoration house called Scene Savers, which is in Covington, Kentucky. And they came with a truck that is archive safe, and they picked up reels, restored it, digitized it, brought it back. They rehoused everything in archive safe cans as well, and then I put them back in the archive. And then we also then had high resolution, I think it was 4K scans of all the 16mm film. So it's really great. I mean, you need to work with a restoration house, especially with things that are so brittle. Because also at that point, literally, they were using literally tape on all of the splices. These are news broadcasts from like the early 50s. So anytime there's a cut, the whole reel would break. So it's something that definitely professionals in archive safe environments should handle. But it does create extra costs, of course.
And the archival house is okay with taking it out of there, and taking it to
we were able to work that out. They met the head of the station. Like, it was a long negotiation to get to that point as well.
Yeah, I mean, we have to do another session just on the art and role of archival producers and archival researchers. It's so fascinating.
We are ready, and we have so many members that would be have so many amazing stories.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm tempted to keep going down that path, but we're trying to focus on AI. Gabrielle.
Hi. Thank you for this. This was mind blowing. I love the entire intellectual underpinning that is in all of this, what you are talking about, and was of course blown away by the numbers, the 15 billion since the start of photography, and the 15 billion since last year. And I see what you're doing, and I absolutely want to be like supporting it and everything. But I'm also wondering, how do you see this work in terms of how this wave is actually also changing perception and acceptance of information, or lack of information, and lack of accuracy of information? If I look at the 13-year-old that crosses behind my back here, and what he watches and his generation watches, and they are the ones that are on YouTube all the time, and they don't ask about accuracy. And the 1 billion this year is going to be 3 billion next year. And how do you see what your efforts are right now in terms of the future just 5 years from now? I mean, the same people that, for example, don't know. I mean, I worked as an archival producer on a show where somebody asked me to get film footage from the first Olympics, which were in way before photography was invented. And it was like, the person was blown away by the fact that they didn't even cross that person's mind. And the same thing with, the drone footage for the gold rush generated film, So how do you see this work basically being, as a wall against that wave that is happening while we are talking?
Well, that's a really, that's a really good question. Are you in my mind when I wake up at 3 a.m? No, just kidding.
I mean, this anxiety, of course, is a lot of what brought us to this work. And it was a way, and I will say that on the other side of doing it, I feel like it's a good exercise for everyone to revalidate what it is that's important, and not just worry about what's scary that's coming down the pike. And I will say that, as negative a person as I often am within the group, it has made me feel a little bit hopeful and a little bit of empowerment, because what we're seeing is that people are really hungry for this. Even though, yes, a lot of people are just flying ahead with the technology, a lot more people are worried about where it's going to go and are longing for things that are more authentic and true in some way. You know, when we started doing this, I was comparing it to the beginning of when social media was coming online, and that now, you know, 10, 15 years down the road, many of us look back and think, gosh, we wish we had been a little less quick to just grab it and run with it, especially those of us who have kids, and how that's unfolded. And now we're looking back and saying, and that's what this moment is for AI. So it is here, but just things like this, if other industries are all kind of looking inward and saying, what do we value in the work we're doing? What do we value in the way life is lived right now? What do we value in our careers? And we can just slightly at least shape this in a way that's going to be better, and slow things down and move them along in a way that's going to, you know, hopefully change the course very slightly. You know, if you're trying to change a course over a long period of time, just a little change of degree can move where it's going to end up.
Yeah, and I think something we've been thinking about as far as, you know, next steps for us is we're aware of how hard it is going to be to authenticate material. But there are people like the Starling Lab, like C2PA and the Partnership on AI, that are trying to say, okay, this thing is a real thing. So not labeling what is generated, but labeling what is true. And so, but that doesn't get to your question of what if people just don't care? I think that's a really huge question, and something that brings me here. I think that's to be in a democracy, we need to have facts that we agree upon and things that we trust, that we know are real, and that's very much under question right now, and it does keep me up at night. But I do think that when people are drawn to really good storytelling, people are drawn to details, people are drawn to authenticity that makes them feel special in their own lives, in their own bodies. And I hope that documentary film can continue to do that, because that's certainly what it's always done for me.
Thank you. Thanks, Gabrielle. Jason, then Joanne, then Rich.
Hi, guys. I am not an archival producer or anything, but I love the discussion about AI. I am a documentary filmmaker. My question is kind of also jumps off of what Doug was saying a little bit earlier about the digitization process. And you guys had spoken earlier about the Microsoft AI guy, you know, wanting to redefine fair use, and all of these tech companies are just kind of trying to, you know, steamroll their way with boatloads of cash. And if I was a small archive house, you know, it would be very enticing to have someone come in and offer to pay, you know, to do all of that hard work, and then you give them the opportunity to scrape it. Has there been any discussion? I also know there are some open source models where you download all the training data, and then you can train it on your own stuff and then delete the other training data. So it's more generating things from things that you've already created. Has there been any discussion of a collective effort where, you know, instead of, you know, taking these boatloads of cash from a tech company, you know, using an open source model or something like that, pooling resources to get older footage digitized, and then maintain control of that footage instead of giving it, you know, to OpenAI or Microsoft, in a way to mitigate some of these algorithmic biases that you guys were talking about earlier?
Great idea.
I can't speak to that. We're just starting to educate ourselves around it. We just had a really great call with Rick Pellinger last week and some folks at the BBC. This is where I want to say I'm doing a talk at Footage Fest in LA at the end of September, which I recommend if anybody's interested in this. And I'm going to be in conversation with folks from Focal, Fiat IFTA, which is a Federation of International Television Archives, and AMCUP, and a few others on this exact issue. Something I've become increasingly aware of is there isn't yet a standard. like the C2PA standards are not yet actually published. And I think that's good. You want guidelines to be not reactionary, but you need guidelines to be fully thought through. And if you come out too quickly with things, they might be implemented incorrectly. But I think that's a really great question and kind of where we're headed next. So sounds like you should become a member of the APA.
Yeah, I was going to say, bring those ideas to us. That's
I've scanned the QR code. I've scanned the QR code. You got
all right,
you
nice.
had me at
But
hello.
it's a huge question about how do we know as archival producers when we download something from a Getty or anything that it's real, and we don't know.
We don't, and
always.
there's all kinds of talks about, you know, digital watermarking, both that is visible and invisible. It's like imprinted, but then there are also ways to lift that out, and it's what they're calling it, like, you know, it's an arms race in some way, that people are just kind of trying to get their heads around and stay ahead of.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Thank you, Jason. Joanne and Rich, we're coming up against our end time, so try and be succinct with your questions. I know you will, Joanne, because you always are. Go ahead.
Hi, Joanna.
My question is very, very brief, and I think Gabriella asked it already, mentioned it, that younger people don't realize that there isn't video material of stuff older than a certain time, the 1800s, the 1700s back. They don't realize that there aren't pictures of that, because in their life, there are pictures of everything. So they don't understand that. And I'm concerned about what we've all heard about fake news. This is gonna be a really big thing, and it is already. People using generative AI to create what they say is news and real people. And how are you putting that? What kind of guidelines are you putting in your document to safeguard against that?
Yeah, I mean, that's not really within the scope of the guidelines, but I think it really gets at what we were talking about media literacy. And I think there needs to be a big push, especially with the younger generations, but really with everyone. It's media literacy for a new age. And I don't know who's organizing that. Something we'd certainly be thrilled to get involved in. And I think it is really important as a next step. There's just a lot of work to be done because, you know, as we said, this isn't moving at a human pace, and we all are. So we're constantly racing to keep ahead of the different issues that are coming up as a result of the changes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joanne. Rich, final question, then I will ask the long-awaited question. I've been.
I'm really curious.
Okay.
Hi, Rich.
Okay, hello. I'll try to be real brief. I'm a filmmaker. I produce, direct, and edit my films. I've been teaching and shooting in West Africa over the last 5 years. I'm working on two documentaries, and I've been I've been looking to AI as a way to go back and create some historical facts. One is about an artisanal gold mine in Mali that I actually found during research. It was founded in 1235, the year after the founding of the Malian Empire, and
wow.
That chief was actually involved with Sundiata Keita, the founder of the Malian Empire, and created the human right, their first human rights document. So I've been challenged in dealing with finding archival information either in Guinea or France, and then I'm debating on what type of platform I can use to maybe recreate some scenes, because after researching the history, there's some amazing scenes that I would like to create. So I'm just reaching out for feedback, because like I said, there's a challenge as far as getting archival records. I do have some maps and what have you. So I'm just throwing that out.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of finding archival in those countries, it's sometimes better to get someone on the ground who can actually go into archives. That would be my recommendation on that. I don't know what is the best platform to create the AI stuff on. We're not really.
I don't either. And I also think, you know, in general, when when we're dealing with stories that the archive is not there, we should also think, why do we need to use the same storytelling format that so many have used when there is archive available? So maybe there's a way that you can be very imaginative. You don't necessarily need to fall into the same format or relay information in the same way that something on like PBS might do, that does have a lot of archive.
Great.
All right, what's this question, Doug?
Thanks, Rich.
Thank you,
well,
Rich. Nice to meet you. That also sounds like an amazing project, by the way. This is so fun to meet everybody.
It's the $1 million question that I hope is literally not $1 million question. You know, we have a lot of filmmakers here who want to work with, you know, archival footage. You talked about the importance of bringing on archival producers early as possible, but we're all struggling with funding. You know, many of us are working without, you know, out of our pockets, you know, and how do we navigate that? Is it, when we say bring in early, can you come on, like, say, as a consult, you know, do a couple of consults early?
Yeah.
So, and how do you budget? How do we, you know what to even budget for an archival producer and archival researcher? On a, it's not a series, on a one-off feature documentary,
Sure.
Just ballpark idea.
I think we might both have different answers. So, I mean, what I'll say is, I think it's good to bring someone on. You can pay them, ask them what their hourly rate is, and pay them to consult for, you know, 2 hours. Like that will even probably save you money. Like I get brought onto projects sometimes, you know, just to say, oh, okay, so you're making a film about Atlanta in the 1970s. Okay, definitely go to UGA. I know just from working with them, like their rates are X amount per minute. And so estimate how much footage you're going to use, how much photos you think you're going to use. It's all an estimate. And then from there, you can kind of do it. But if someone came to me, for example, and said, I'm making a film about Louisville in the 1950s, I'd say, well, you will have to get into this archive and it will be very expensive. So it really, like, archival producers that are experienced know about archival troves and kind of how to get them, and they can introduce you to them, or, you know, at least like show you resources and just give you a general overview. Whereas getting that information on your own, if you've never dealt with this material, is really hard and might cause problems. So I'm curious what you would say, Rachel.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is not that different from what you're saying, but I will say, like, we work on a lot of projects where the funding is very fluid and we expect our time on it to be fluid. So when we come on a project, we'll say, well, you know, where are you at in it? We get a sense of what the scope of it is to give them a little sense of what it might look like down the line, both in terms of our time and the licensing. But we know that it's always a very broad estimate. And we do work on an hourly rate, which I think a lot of archival producers do. Some do day rate or weekly rate, but we find hourly rate works best. And we're always in conversation with the filmmaker. So if they say, I can pay for 10 hours, you know, straight up, we have them prioritize. You know, we have a wish list with priorities on it. You know, so we know we should go for these things first and these things second and these things third. And that really ensures that for the money, they're going to get what they need. And then after 10 hours, we check in. This is what we've been able to do for this amount of time. How much more can you? And it kind of keeps going, the conversation like that. But we're very used to being brought in for a few hours of consultation at the beginning, brought back in once some funds are raised, disappear again, brought back in during the edit. And it kind of goes like that. There's a
sounds like what's great is bring you in when you're doing a budget so that you can give feedback on what to put in as well.
Do not, yes,
that's huge.
Really try to, if you're making an archival budget, have an archival producer look at it.
Yes, if you take
because often what I see, people are like, well, I want this to be an all archival film, and they budget $15,000, and I'm like, you're not going to be able to raise money correctly if that is the case.
Yeah. You may not be comfortable saying what your rate is, but can you, if not, can you give us an idea of what the range of rates that
We're
archival
actually going to be
producers
doing
charge?
a
An hour of
we're doing a rate
consulting?
survey. Yeah, we're doing a rate survey right now.
And we'll release that. And we're also creating guidelines for working with archival producers, which should give a lot of this information. And that will live on our site for people to come and reference, sort of answering all of these questions. I hope these are,
Yeah.
it's good to know this is what filmmakers.
But I don't want to give an incorrect figure right now, but we actually are we do have a member who's working on that right now, and we should have that later this fall, probably.
Yeah.
We just
Whatever
have a
it
range.
is, whatever it is, it's going to save filmmakers a ton of money. So I always encourage filmmakers to hire consultants, you know, at different stages for different purposes, whether story, producing, archival, will just save you gobs and gobs of money.
Which is why we're all in this business, right?
That's why we're in. That's why AI is taking off, to save you gobs and gobs of money and time. Thank you so much. This was fantastic having you here. Really look forward to reading the guidelines. I hope a lot of people will sign up and, you know, get your newsletters and follow your progress. And we'll try and come back and do one just focused on the nuts and bolts of archival, because it's so tempting to want to just go down. I'm just fascinated by the process. So thank you again for coming, and thank you everybody for attending.